Okay, let's unpack this because what we're looking at here, it feels like a really foundational shift happening in global finance. We're seeing the old guard, the legacy systems starting to connect with, well, the absolute cutting edge of decentralized tech. So today we are taking a deep dive into this collaboration. It's between SWIFT, the bedrock banking messaging network,
The
and Chainlink, which is dominant in the decentralized Oracle space, but much more here. If you're tracking capital markets or infrastructure plays or, the future of tokenized assets, this conversation, it really matters right now. Our sources today are all focused on the how, the architecture, the sort of complex engineering that's meant to bridge trillions in legacy capital over to the blockchain world.
Yeah, that framing is spot on.
Yeah.
What we're really discussing is it's nothing less than an attempt to create a standard playbook, a standard operating procedure for basically every major bank globally to access these decentralized ledgers. And just to be super clear upfront about the players involved, the scale here is huge. On one side, you've got SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. Now remember, they're not a bank themselves. They're the messaging system, the central nervous system for almost every cross-border financial transaction.
It's the language they all speak, the financial Esperanto almost.
Exactly. It's the lingua franca. We're talking, what, 11,500 plus financial institutions across like 200 countries. They all rely on SWIFT for everything, really. Simple money transfers, complex security settlements, you name it. It's been the king of interbank communication for well over 50 years. It's deeply, deeply embedded. And crucially, it's trusted within that traditional finance or TradFi world.
Okay, so that's the established giant. And then the other side is Chainlink. Now, we mostly know them for their oracles, right? Bringing real-world data securely onto blockchains, which is vital. But here, their role seems to be expanding, becoming more foundational, more about interoperability.
Precisely. The focus shifts here. It's really about their cross-chain interoperability protocol, or CCIP. Chainlink is aiming to provide the secure, standardized plumbing needed to talk not just between a blockchain and the outside world, but, and this is key, between different blockchains and between blockchains and legacy systems, like SWIFT. That's a huge expansion of what they traditionally do.
Right. So you put these two heavyweights together, SWIFT and Chainlink. What's the big claim? What's the headline? What's the mission statement for this whole deep dive?
The gist. It's all about enabling the infrastructure. The whole point of this collaboration is to let banks tap into the potential of blockchains, things like tokenization, smart contracts, but using their existing SWIFT messaging infrastructure, the rails they already have, so they get to avoid what every big bank absolutely dreads.
The rip and replace.
Exactly. That huge multi-year, multi-billion-dollar nightmare of tearing out their core systems and starting again. This approach basically makes Web3 accessible, but through the familiar front door of TradFi.
Yeah, I mean, that immediately clicks. It tackles that massive problem of institutional inertia, right? If I'm running tech at a major bank, the idea of overhauling 50 years of stable, audited infrastructure just to, I don't know, try out tokenized T-bills, it's just too much. Too costly, too risky, too slow.
It really is. Think of it like this. Are you going to build a completely new subway system from scratch? Or are you going to upgrade the signals and controls on the existing tracks? One takes decades and billions. The other, you can roll out piece by piece, incrementally. So this strategy, it's about giving banks a much lower friction path, a way to explore this huge emerging market of tokenized assets without betting the farm.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Let's move past the high-level strategy. Let's talk engineering, the practical stuff. What exactly are they building? The sources mention this enterprise abstraction layer. Can you sort of unpack that? What are the actual steps banks take to get on-chain with this setup?
Yeah, absolutely. They're essentially building very sophisticated middleware. Think of this abstraction layer, which is powered by Chainlink, as a kind of universal financial translator. It sits right at the bank's gateway, metaphorically speaking. And its main job is translation. It takes those highly standardized, secure SWIFT messages, the old FEO messages or the newer ISO 2022 format, and translates those instructions into an action that makes sense on a blockchain, a decentralized blockchain native action.
So let's take an example. A bank doing a standard security settlement, they might send out, an MT540 SWIFT message code. Under this new system, does that same code now trigger something completely different, something on-chain?
Precisely. That's the elegance of it. The bank sends that standard instruction, that MT540, using their existing SWIFT connection, the same way they always have. But when that message hits this new middleware layer, Chainlink services recognize it, they validate it, and then they convert it into a trigger for some kind of on-chain logic. So that could be, say, automatically minting a tokenized bond, or initiating a cross-chain transfer of a digital security, or maybe executing a predefined smart contract condition like releasing collateral. The key is the bank itself is shielded from the messy details, the complexities and differences of the specific target blockchain.
Wow. So the bank's operations team, they're just using the tools they know, the systems that are already audited, already compliant, but their actions suddenly have these effects on distributed ledgers. That's quite clever.
It is. And this is where Chainlink's cross-chain interoperability protocol, CCIP, becomes absolutely central. It's the linchpin. Because, look, the banking world isn't going to settle on just one type of blockchain, right? They'll use private permission chains, things like Hyperledger Fabric or Quorum for certain things, but they might also interact with public chains, Ethereum, maybe others for different use cases. So they need a standard, reliable way to move value and instructions between all these different environments securely.
Okay, so CCIP acts like the traffic controller, the router. But, we're talking global finance here. It can't just be about speed. What about security, trust? How does CCIP make sure that, say, a $100 million settlement instruction doesn't get messed up as it jumps between these different systems?
That's a critical point, and it's really what differentiates this approach from some of the earlier, let's say, more vulnerable cross-chain bridges we've seen. CCIP isn't designed as a single point of failure. It relies on a decentralized network, specifically a network of Chainlink Oracle nodes. These are independent operators who validate and secure the message flow. It's not just one entity controlling it, and on top of that, it incorporates something they call risk management networks.
Okay, decentralized risk management. What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, it means you have separate, highly secure Chainlink Oracle networks whose only job is to monitor the messages being sent. They check for integrity, for consistency, before anything actually gets executed on the destination chain. Think of it like a secondary safety inspection line. If this risk management network spots any kind of discrepancy, any anomaly between what the primary oracle's validated and what's about to happen, it can halt the process, pause the transfer. This kind of multi-layered security, this defense in depth, it's absolutely essential when you're talking about moving institutional amounts of money. And frankly, it's what gives organizations like SWIFT the confidence even to consider integrating with this technology.
I see. So the complexity, like dealing with different block confirmation times finality between, say, a fast private chain and a slower public one, that gets absorbed by this secure middleware layer. The bank doesn't have to worry about those timing differences.
Precisely. The middleware essentially smooths out those wrinkles. It abstracts away the underlying consensus mechanisms, the different finality rules. What it provides back to the SWIFT system, back to the bank, is a clear result. Either the action executed successfully or it failed. And that deterministic outcome is exactly what banks need for their accounting, for their balance sheet management. They need certainty.
And this isn't just a white paper concept. They've actually tested this, right? Put it through its paces in a real-world scenario. Let's talk about that UBS pilot study.
Yeah.
What exactly did they set out to prove, and what did they find?
Yes, the UBS pilot is really important validation. UBS, obviously a huge global player in finance, they focus specifically on tokenizing and managing investment funds. The goal was to demonstrate that a bank could use a standard traditional SWIFT message to completely automate the life cycle of a tokenized fund. We're talking about the whole process, subscription, redemption, the works.
Okay, so that involves managing both the traditional money movement, the fiat currency, and the digital asset side, the tokens, simultaneously. How did that dual-leg settlement actually work in the pilot?
It was designed to showcase what they call atomic settlement, or at least near atomic efficiency. So imagine an investor wants to buy into a tokenized fund. The first leg is the traditional regulated movement of money, the fiat currency. That happens via the existing SWIFT network, from the investor's bank to the fund's bank. All the usual checks, balances, compliance that stays in place.
Okay, standard procedure there. And the blockchain side, the tokens.
So either happening at the same time, or perhaps triggered upon confirmation that the fiat money has moved. The blockchain leg kicks in. The SWIFT message, processed by the Chainlink middleware, triggers the minting the creation of the corresponding tokenized fund shares. These new tokens are then delivered directly to the investor's digital wallet address. And redemption works the same way, just in reverse. A SWIFT instruction triggers the fiat payment out, and the middleware coordinates the burning or destruction of the tokens. So this hybrid model, it successfully stitched together the old and the new, the trusted legacy payment system, with the efficiency and automation of blockchain asset management.
It really seems like the strategic decision to leverage SWIFT to work with the existing network rather than trying to replace it is the most pragmatic way forward for getting banks on board. It's not just about making things more efficient, is it? It feels like a survival strategy for SWIFT itself, ensuring they stay relevant in this new world.
Oh, absolutely. You've hit on a key point. The immediate network effects are potentially enormous because SWIFT already connects, 11,500 institutions? If they adopt this interoperability standard, it means they could, theoretically, plug that entire existing global network into the world of blockchain almost overnight. No other project, no public chain, no private consortium. Nobody has that kind of instant global reach on day one.
So avoiding the rip and replace isn't just about saving money for the banks. It's about speed to market. It buys SWIFT and its members' market share in this rapidly growing RWA real-world asset tokenization space.
Yes, it solidifies Swift's position, and it positions Chainlink as this absolutely critical piece of shared infrastructure. The source materials really hammer this home. Banks can engage with this new financial paradigm with tokenized assets without having to tear down their core systems that are complex, critical, and have worked reliably for decades. They're essentially just adding a secure plugin, an interoperability layer that lets them interact with these external ledgers.
Okay, but let's pause here. Because fusing these two worlds together, legacy finance, which is all about, control, layers, conservatism, and blockchain, which values transparency, cryptographic proof. That sounds incredibly complex. Surely when you bridge worlds that different, you introduce new kinds of friction, new risks. We have to pivot now and talk about the realities, the complexities of this hybrid setup, because no new tech comes without challenges.
You're absolutely right to raise that. It's probably the most important counterpoint. While the technical solution looks elegant on paper, the inherent risks involved in cross-chain bridges are real, and they have to be acknowledged. Especially at this scale. We've seen security research, some of which we looked at, that meticulously catalogs all the known ways these bridges can be attacked. And sadly, we have real-world examples of catastrophic failures. Wormhole lost hundreds of millions. Ronin, nearly $600 million.
Right. And often those bridges were just moving native crypto assets, maybe some NFTs. This SWIFT Chainlink infrastructure. Eventually, it's supposed to secure settlement instructions for potentially trillions in global capital markets. The stakes are just astronomically higher.
They're exponentially higher. This middleware layer, even with all its decentralized security features like the risk management networks we discussed, it still represents a critical point of connection, an aggregation risk, if you will. If there were ever a systemic flaw discovered in the core validation mechanisms of the CCIP implementation used here, the potential for simultaneous multi-chain exploitation affecting numerous banks could be devastating. The engineering has to be flawless, the ongoing auditing relentless. There's very little room for error.
Which brings us directly to the question of trust and governance, doesn't it? If this bridge does become the world's financial plumbing, who actually controls it? Who sets the standards? Who oversees the upgrades, the security audits? Is the decentralized nature of Chainlink's network enough to satisfy the regulators and the very centralized risk management departments within global banks?
Oh, that's the fundamental tension here, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's right at the heart of whether this gets fully adopted. Banks want the security guarantees that decentralization offers. No single point of failure. But they also need clear, accountable, institutional-level governance, someone they can point to, someone who manages the standards. The sources suggest they're trying to address this by setting up consortiums, working groups, trying to build that institutional layer on top of the decentralized tech. But it's a balancing act.
Yeah.
And beyond governance, there's also practical technical friction, things like latency and throughput.
Right. Latency. Why is that such a potential headache when you're bridging these two systems?
Well, think about traditional finance systems, especially for internal bank operations. They run on highly optimized centralized databases. Finality is basically instant. Banks use the settlement cycles, maybe T+2 for some things, T+2 for others, where every step is predictable, timed precisely. Now, you introduce interaction with, say, a public blockchain. Suddenly, you have variable finality. Confirmation times depend on network traffic, block production times, the specific consensus rules of that chain. Getting truly secure, irreversible finality on a major proof-of-stake chain might take, 10, 15 minutes? Sometimes longer for absolute economic certainty.
And that variability, that potential delay, that could wreak havoc in systems designed for high-frequency trading or real-time gross settlement where timing is everything.
Absolutely. This hybrid architecture has to find ways to manage those timing discrepancies effectively. It can't introduce unacceptable delays or create complex reconciliation headaches. Imagine the fiat leg settles instantly via SWIFT, but the token leg on the blockchain is held up, waiting for enough block confirmations. That delay undermines the efficiency gains, and worse, it actually increases counterparty risk during that waiting period.
Okay, so technical hurdles exist, but arguably with enough smart engineering, they might be solvable. But then you have the non-technical hurdles, and in finance, these often feel like the bigger mountains to climb. Let's talk regulatory complexity. Compliance, that always seems to move at a geological pace.
You said it. This is often the real showstopper, the actual adoption killer. Yeah. Because when a bank tokenizes an asset, a bond, a fund share, whatever, they are not escaping regulation. Not at all. They're just applying the old, complex rules to a new technological format. KYC, know your customer. AML, anti-money laundering. Those requirements have to be perfectly maintained, provably so. And if that tokenized security moves across borders, it instantly becomes subject to the securities laws of multiple different jurisdictions.
So this middleware layer, this Chainlink bridge, it can't just translate the financial instruction. It also has to act as a compliance checkpoint, a gatekeeper.
Exactly. Yeah. It has to be designed to enforce the rules. It needs to prove it can restrict who can hold or transfer the token. Yeah. It needs to verify counterparty identities, maybe via linked identity solutions, and it needs to generate accurate transaction reports for all the relevant regulatory bodies, even though the asset itself might live on a pseudonymous ledger. The UBS pilot was interesting here because it showed that while the token operations could be automated, the underlying legal checks, the identity verification, that still relied heavily on the robust but slower traditional SWIFT system and its associated databases. If this hybrid approach can't demonstrate absolutely bulletproof compliance, regulators will just say no, regardless of how technically slick it is.
And that leads to the final hurdle, which is almost cultural adoption inertia. I liked your geological pace analogy earlier because it feels true. Getting these massive conservative institutions to change direction takes immense effort.
It really does. Banks manage trillions of dollars. Their prime directive is stability. Stability always trumps efficiency until the lack of efficiency starts to threaten stability. So even if the technology is proven secure, compliant, and efficient, the actual decision to adopt it involves huge committees, legal teams, risk officers, compliance departments, all weighing in. They'll demand long periods of parallel running where the old system runs alongside the new one for maybe years. That generates significant costs and operational complexity up front, long before they feel comfortable switching off the old system, even for limited use cases beyond pilots.
Okay, so we've covered the architecture, the potential, the risks, the hurdles. Let's zoom out again. Let's analyze the so what. Why does this matter from a broader market perspective? Why should, the average investor, just someone curious about crypto, care about the nitty-gritty of this SWIFT Chainlink middleware?
Yeah, this is where we connect the plumbing back to the potential financial revolution. This whole initiative, this partnership, it directly tackles what people in the industry often call the last mile problem. You could say the first mile was inventing blockchain technology itself, Bitcoin, Ethereum, smart contracts. But the last mile, the really hard part, is building the secure, trusted, and importantly, compliant bridge. The bridge that allows massive amounts of institutional capital, trillions of dollars, to actually flow onto these new rails safely.
And the idea is, once that bridge is built, stable, audited, and accepted, the floodgates can start to open.
That's the thesis. Absolutely. This kind of infrastructure is seen as a key enabler for the massive acceleration of RWA tokenization, real-world asset tokenization. We hear about tokenization all the time, right? The promise is huge. Unlocking liquidity in traditionally illiquid assets, slashing settlement costs, bringing transparency to opaque markets. Think private equity, commercial real estate, maybe even things like fine art or carbon credits eventually. But definitely starting with financial instruments.
So if banks find it easy or easier to issue, trade, and settle these tokenized assets using their familiar SWIFT setup, which RWAs do you think benefit first? Where's the initial focus likely to be?
Well, based on the pilots like UBS and just general industry logic, the initial focus seems to be on assets that are already highly standardized, high value, and have relatively clear regulatory frameworks. So investment funds are a prime candidate, as we saw. Tokenized government bonds like U.S. Treasuries are another big one. And also things like interbank lending, repurchase agreements, repos, basically improving the plumbing of existing wholesale financial markets. Making settlement instant, global, and automated for these core instruments could move billions, maybe trillions, in collateral management on-chain. That represents huge operational cost savings for the entire banking sector.
Okay, now let's flip this and look at it from Chainlink's perspective. What does this mean for them strategically? If this whole system actually takes off, if banks adopt it widely, what does that do for Chainlink's position in the market? It seems like they wouldn't just be a provider. They become almost like a mandated utility, wouldn't they?
That's arguably the end game, yes. If Chainlink, through CCIP and its associated services, becomes the accepted, standardized middleware layer, the go-to solution for thousands of banks needing to interact with any blockchain, public or private, that creates an incredibly powerful network effect, a really formidable infrastructure moat, as analysts like to say. Think about it. Who else has that combination? Decentralized security credibility, years of institutional trust built from providing Oracle data feeds, and now this potential deep integration with the existing SWIFT network. It makes them the universal connective tissue, and that makes them incredibly difficult for a competitor to dislodge.
And for the native token, is AMD?
The implications seem pretty profound, too. It shifts the narrative, doesn't it? From maybe speculative potential to actual tangible utility. The utility story changes dramatically, yes. If this sees widespread institutional use, it drives predictable, sustained demand for Chainlink's core services. Because securing all those CCIP messages, providing all the necessary off-chain data feeds like verified price data for assets, or maybe KYC status checks needed for smart contracts, all that activity requires the Chainlink network to function. It requires nodes to be staked, services to be paid for, likely using Illion. So the token's value proposition potentially transitions from being heavily tied to crypto market sentiment and future narratives to being underpinned by its necessary role in securing and operating a critical piece of global financial infrastructure. That could lead to more stable demand, increased staking, and significant fee revenue over time.
We absolutely have to touch on the competitive landscape here because for years there was this narrative, especially around projects like Ripple and its XRP ledger. The story was often framed as XRP being built to disrupt or even replace SWIFT, because SWIFT's traditional messaging, particularly for cross-border payments, was seen as slow, expensive, kind of archaic technology.
Right. That narrative definitely positioned XRP and similar projects as the faster, cheaper, modern alternative, designed to bypass SWIFT's older correspondent banking system.
What's so fascinating about this SWIFT-Chainlink partnership is that it shows SWIFT choosing to evolve rather than just wait to be replaced. They're essentially saying, okay, blockchain offers benefits, speed, automation, tokenization, we'll embrace those benefits. But they're doing it by integrating an interoperability layer, Chainlink, rather than surrendering their central coordinating role in the financial system.
So instead of SWIFT being leapfrogged by a potentially faster payment rail like XRP, SWIFT is using an interoperability solution, Chainlink, to maintain its dominance across the entire spectrum of financial communication, both the old fiat world and the new tokenized world. That seems to be the strategic play, yes. SWIFT is defending its incumbency, not necessarily by trying to beat blockchain projects at their own game of pure transaction speed, but by becoming the bridge, the enabler, for the very tokenized asset market that some thought might make its legacy systems obsolete.
It definitely complicates that original XRP or replaces SWIFT thesis. It shows the incumbent can adapt and can use its massive existing network as its biggest weapon.
And this kind of collaboration, if successful, it could create positive ripple effects, right? A feedback loop across the whole crypto and TradFi ecosystem. For sure. Think about standardization. If the world's biggest banks, through SWIFT, start to converge on a common standard for blockchain interoperability and handling tokenized assets via Chainlink, that reduces fragmentation, it lowers risk and integration costs for everyone else in the ecosystem. You could see more institutional liquidity feeling comfortable flowing into the DeFi applications, provided they meet compliance standards. You could see institutional treasurers allocating more capital to tokenized instruments because they become easier to manage, settle, and integrate into existing workflows. And, crucially, it creates stronger incentives for developers. Why build on some obscure, isolated standard when the biggest players were coalescing around this SWIFT Chainlink bridge? The whole ecosystem tends to rally around established standards.
Okay, this whole deep dive really underscores that we're talking about long-term structural infrastructure bets here. This isn't about short-term price speculation. So for those of us watching this space, maybe as long-term investors, maybe just as curious learners trying to understand where finance is going, what should we actually be monitoring? How do we track whether this big infrastructure decision is actually succeeding in the real world?
Yeah. For anyone looking at this with a long-term lens, the focus has to shift. It moves away from just reading white papers or announcements towards looking at cold, hard operational data. The investment case for something like Chainlink, in this context, really hinges on whether this translates into large-scale, real-world, institutional adoption. If this SWIFT partnership actually starts moving significant value, solving tangible problems for banks, That creates genuine utility. It builds that defensibility we talked about.
And for traders, maybe those looking for shorter-term catalysts, what's the angle there?
Well, news flow obviously remains critical in the crypto space. Big announcements can still move markets significantly. So a major Tier 1 bank publicly committing to using CCIP via SWIFT, or a consortium of banks in a major region formally adopting it, or maybe a G20 central bank acknowledging this architecture in a report. Any of those could definitely trigger speculative rallies. So watching for news about expanded pilots, successful proofs of concept moving to production, or formal pre-onboarding announcements is key. The market often struggles to price in the true impact of fundamental infrastructure shifts until they're much closer to mass rollout.
Right. But beyond just headlines and press releases, if we want to gauge real traction, we need measurable indicators, concrete data points. What specific metrics should we be putting on our dashboards to track this?
Okay, good question. I think there are a few key ones based on the sources and just logical rollout. First, and maybe most critical, is the adoption trajectory. You need to track the actual number of banks and financial institutions, especially the big Tier 1 and Tier 2 players that are officially onboarded, or at least participating in active ongoing pilots or publicly committing to phased rollouts over time. Is that number growing? How fast? A steepening curve signals success.
So that shows banks are signing up, but are they actually using it?
Exactly. Which leads to the second key metric, economic throughput. We need visibility somehow into the volume. The notional value of tokenized assets actually flowing across this SWIFT Chainlink connection. Is this bridge facilitating $1 million worth of transfers a day? Or is it $1 billion? Or more? Seeing real financial value move is the ultimate proof of utility. If the throughput stays tiny, it's still just an experiment.
Makes sense. And we probably also need to look at Chainlink side of things, the health of the service itself.
Absolutely. Third metric, service utilization and revenue. We need to monitor Chainlink's own reported metrics, if available. Things like the number of CCIP transactions being processed, the value secured by the network, or potentially the revenue being generated by these interoperability and data services. Is the network actually being put under real load by this institutional activity? And finally, a fourth area, regulatory standardization. We need to watch for progress on the governance and standards front. Are we seeing mentions of this specific hybrid architecture in publications from major standards bodies like ISO, or in reports from banking regulators like the BIS or national central banks? Regulatory acceptance or endorsement is the ultimate green light for truly global systemic deployment.
Okay, looking even further ahead now, assuming this gets traction, where could this technology go next? What are some of the potential, maybe slightly more speculative future extensions beyond just tokenizing funds and bonds?
Well, one really significant potential extension is integrating with central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. If, or perhaps when, major central banks start issuing their own digital currencies, those CBDCs will need ways to interact securely and efficiently with the existing commercial banking system. They'll need to move between central bank ledgers, commercial bank systems, financial market infrastructures, maybe even back into legacy payment rails. This SWIFT Chainlink architecture seems perfectly positioned to be that critical interoperability bridge for CBDCs. That's a potential market measured in the trillions.
Wow, yeah, connecting CBDCs is huge. And beyond that, are we talking about bringing more complex financial instruments onto these rails eventually?
That seems like the logical progression. Once the basic plumbing is proven for simpler assets, you could see broader adoption for tokenized debt instruments, maybe cross-border real estate deals packaged as tokens, securitizations, complex derivatives, sophisticated collateral management strategies. Anything where the current process involves slow, manual, bilateral settlements could potentially be transformed into faster, automated, perhaps even multilateral settlements using this kind of secure middleware.
Okay, let's just indulge in one final speculative thought experiment here, tying it back to the LNK token and the scale we discussed. If this is wildly successful, let's say hypothetically, 8,000 out of those 11,500 SWIFT member banks eventually plug into this architecture over the next decade. What's the ultimate consequence? What does LNK become?
Well, if that scenario plays out, and it's a big if, obviously, then Link arguably stops being perceived primarily as just another crypto asset. It becomes something much more fundamental, a mission-critical piece of digital plumbing for the core of global finance. Its role would be securing the validation and movement of potentially trillions in global capital flows across different ledgers. In that world, its value would be intrinsically tied to the economic utility it provides, the security guarantees, much more so than just market sentiment or speculative narratives. But we have to keep stressing the flip side. The risk profile also changes. If there were ever a massive, highly public security failure in that middleware, say a hack that affects multiple banks simultaneously through this shared infrastructure, the reputational damage, the financial losses, the regulatory backlash, it could be catastrophic. It could halt institutional adoption of this kind of cross-chain tech for a generation. The stakes are immense.
It really forces that mental shift, doesn't it, from thinking about crypto as speculation towards thinking about crypto as infrastructure. And maybe that conceptual shift is the most important takeaway for anyone trying to figure out the long-term potential, the staying power of this market beyond the hype cycles.
I think that's a perfect summary. In short, this SWIFT and Chainlink partnership, it represents a potentially massive structural shift. It offers the established legacy banking system a critical bridge, a standards-aware way to finally start interacting with the blockchain world. And critically, it solves that huge inertia problem by letting them do it without tearing everything down and starting over.
But the success isn't guaranteed just by the tech. It still hinges on convincing those conservative clients to actually cross the bridge.
Exactly. The pilots, like the one with UBS, they've shown it's technically feasible. The engineering seems sound. But scaling that up to full global deployment, getting universal regulatory agreement and harmonization, maintaining that deep institutional commitment through the inevitable bumps in the road, those are the next massive hurdles. The technology might be ready, but the bureaucratic, legal, and cultural rollout, that's the wide open field we all need to watch very closely now.
So, what does all this mean for you, listening in? We've unpacked how SWIFT, arguably the biggest piece of traditional financial infrastructure, is placing a huge bet on Chainlink's interoperability middleware. Its defensive move, an evolutionary step, the technology looks promising, the pilots are working, but the risks, both technical and institutional, remain significant. So the big question lingers. Is the biggest obstacle to mass adoption now a potential technological failure? Or is it simply overcoming the deep-seated conservative inertia of the global banking system itself? We'd love to know what you think. Do you believe Chainlink is on track to become this foundational plumbing layer for global finance? Why or why not? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments below. And look, if you find these deep dives into crypto infrastructure valuable, if you want to keep tracking these crucial developments with us, then making sure you're subscribed to the channel, maybe leaving a like or a comment, it honestly makes a huge difference. Engaging with this content really does help support the channel. It boosts our visibility in the algorithms, lets more people find this information, and fundamentally, it allows us to keep putting in the time and effort to create this kind of detailed, hopefully high-quality crypto analysis for you. So thank you for diving in with us today.